You are in for an interesting ride.
Hello, folks, and welcome to another ET Newsroom segment. This one is in memoriam for Dr. Bruce Maccabee, who passed on Thursday, the 9th of May, 2024. I interviewed Dr. Maccabee some years ago, in fact, on the 14th of July, 2015, for my Ammach Files radio show, my podcast. So I thought it would be really interesting for you to hear what he had to say those years back. Dr. Bruce Maccabee was an amazingly talented man. Not only was he a physicist, he worked for the Navy. He was a great researcher in all things UFOs, was deeply interested in everything from the Kenneth Arnold 1947 event to from MUFON upwards, downwards, and in between. He was also a great musician, and so were some of his family. So I thought I would share this with you. I hadn't expected to be putting anything out at the moment whilst I take a break from interviewing and concentrate on things Eklectia, the Experiencer album. By way of in memoriam, I really wanted to share this piece as my contribution to the memory of the late, great Dr. Bruce Maccabee. Enjoy. Hello and welcome to program 39, can you believe it, of the Ammach Files. It's Tuesday and it's around 11. We're getting a little bit further from that 11 these days, and it's the 14th of July 2015. I'm looking at the strife and all that's going on globally and reflected personally, and I made a comment recently to a very wise friend of mine about resolving things, about getting those things sorted out. And what she said, I think, is worth sharing because it was really lovely. She said, you know, Joanne, you really cannot resolve things and you cannot resolve things. So what she was talking about was really going back either in your mind or whatever, or actually to visit a situation with you having full knowledge in hindsight, because when you go back to the same situation, the other parties wouldn't have changed effectively. So you couldn't affect anything because you'd be different vibrationally, which was really an interesting thing I hadn't even thought about. But what she said is that what we need to do is to dissolve, not resolve. And she was talking about issues, challenges, and that kind of thing. And I thought, my goodness, yes, that is absolutely right. And I hadn't thought about using the word dissolve instead of resolve. It just has a very different orientation to it. And I thought that's exactly what I do in my therapy work. It's exactly how I work for myself when I'm working through my own system personally, and also when I'm working with others. And there is a dissolving, and I might not even call it that either, but it is a resolving of the originating issue. So that was, I thought, just an interesting thought, and I took that away. And then she cited the wonderful Eckhart Tolle, who said, because so many people I know are going through such tough times and feeling that there is nothing but darkness around them. And I'm not wanting to flag that up as the way things are, but somehow it is for some people. And this is what he said that she cited, and I thought it was lovely and it helped me. Said, I wish I could show you, when you are lonely or in darkness, the astonishing light of your own being. And I think we've all been there in those dark spaces. And you know, sometimes I didn't feel like there was much light, but you know what? That is so beautiful. And I'm just going to write that out and put it somewhere where I can see it generally. So I just wanted to share that with you. And then I wanted to just bring you onto a few things Ammach. And I've been looking for different ways of moving information forward about the experiencer experience and the story, and about how to meet the public more, how to share with people, the general public, about what experiences go through and why it's important. And anyway, because so many experiences I've met and spoken to are very creative, many of them are musicians as well. And it's a fact now that we know, especially from people like Grant Cameron's work, that there's a tremendous amount of inspired musicians who are really successful, who talk about either having information, songs or music channeled, and they don't know where that's from necessarily, or some attribute it directly to ET, which is interesting and not often thought understanding of where their music comes from. So the same with Mike Smith. And again, for those who don't know who Mike Smith is, I've just finished co-authoring a book with him about his incredible life story over the last 3 years. And he's a lead guitarist, he's a musician, and we're talking about how we could perhaps through music do something. So we've come up with the idea of a one-day music festival, maybe next Easter we're sort of looking at it, with experiencers as well as other musicians who, you don't have to be an experiencer, sort of contributing to a fundraiser for Ammach. And the idea is that we'd be playing music, so you'd have all the great music stuff, and then you'd get a little bit of an input about the stories, a little snapshot of some of the experiences that people have been through, some of the musicians or some of the other people around. And I think that would be a really exciting event, a lovely way to share with people. And so anyway, that's on the table for next year sometime. Anyway, I know that you will be wondering who on earth I've got on as my guest tonight. And I won't keep you in tenterhooks any longer. It is the very wonderful Dr. Bruce Maccabee, PhD. Now, he's a physicist, and his work has been with the Navy and strategic defense, and we'll hear a little bit about that later on. He's also, which is wonderful, a honky-tonk music man. I mean, he may say he's more than honky-tonk, but certainly the honky-tonk element is what he resonates with. And his wonderful daughter also heads up a band called Gal Holiday. So before I bring on Dr. Bruce Maccabee, retired physicist and also a 40-year UFO researcher and analyst, we are going to play one of Dr. Bruce Maccabee's pieces, which is his own composition with him playing. And it is called The Flight of the Bumble Boogie. That's woken you
Bravo.
up. Hello, Bruce, and welcome to the Ammach Files. I was just wanting to say, by the way, we were just talking weather with your wife whilst you were getting yourself in from the rain, and she said you've had nearly 22 inches or something since June.
Yes, this has been a wet year. We've been having 1 or 2 downpours every day. Last Saturday was the last day that we didn't have rain. We had a downpour in the afternoon and one at night. Just last night, for example, it was pouring. And then afternoon, major downpour. The rain is coming down so hard that you can barely see through it to the tree line of the pond.
And I just want to say that you were born May 6, 1942, and you went on in your studies to become a physicist, and then you went into the Navy. But perhaps you can just walk us through some of your early life there and whether any of that cross-pollinated to your research in UFOs.
But let me just say that I did Bachelor of Science in 1960, and then a PhD from American University in Washington, D.C. in 1970. It was while I was doing my work for a PhD at American University that I became active in UFO research and actually investigated a few cases. I was not really doing anything unique. I didn't do anything unique until the 1970s. And by that time, I had taken a job with the Navy. I was not in the Navy, in quotes, for the Navy at a laboratory, doing experiments related to underwater sound and stuff like that.
I remember hearing something of an interview that you were working with lasers. Somehow that got the interest of the CIA.
Well, it's all spelled out in my book, The FBI-CIA UFO Connection. Yeah, how I happened to become connected with the CIA, but lasers did have something to do with that, but mainly underwater sound. Generating underwater sound with lasers was what connected me up with the CIA. I had the book that I wrote talks about the impact of the FBI files on UFO research. The FBI files I got in 1977, they contained very interesting information about what had happened back in 1947, 48, 49, 50, 51, 52, the early days. Saying what happened in the first 5 years, you know that the Air Force, top Air Force people knew this stuff was all real years ago and refused to admit that to anybody.
And I believe that you were the first, correct me if I'm wrong, to actually use the Freedom of Information request for FBI files on UFOs. Is that right?
That is correct. I filed my request in September of 1976, and as required, they responded within 10 days with a letter saying, your Freedom of Information Act request is number 34,632, some big number like that. Now, this is 1977. I figured I might hear something from the FBI around the turn of the century. Instead, 6 months later, in May of 78, I got a phone call from an FBI agent who was equally as surprised as I was to find that, gee, the FBI did collect stuff. He says there's over 1,000 pages of stuff here. Over the following days, weeks, months, and years, we got all that stuff out. You can now read it on the FBI's webpage.
So constituted some very interesting information back in those days, bearing in mind even the guy who was facilitating putting together of those papers didn't even realize that there was so much collated by the FBI, in fact.
Oh, well, I'm sure if the Air Force had known what the FBI was going to release, they would have said, stop. But the FBI could see no reason to withhold documents that were 20 or 30 years old and were FBI documents. What happened was the Air Force told the FBI stuff under the assumption that the FBI was like a black hole. Information goes in and nothing comes out. And nothing would have come out if it hadn't been for the Freedom of Information Act. In 1947 and 48, 50 and so on, they never would have conceived of a Freedom of Information Act.
So what were some of the earliest reports that you then had sight of in those mid-70s that was new to you?
Sorry for interrupting, Joanne. The people are having a little difficulty hearing your guest. If there's any way he can increase his volume.
Okay. I don't know whether you heard that.
Heard it. I'm just saying, is that better?
So just as near as you can be to the phone. I'm sorry for that inconvenience because we're on a bit of a long call. Okay, that's great.
I to find that the Air Force had told the FBI things like a certain percentage of the sightings cannot be explained, and that top Air Force officials were seriously considering the possibility of interplanetary ships. That comes right out of the FBI file, but they did the FBI. The Air Force didn't tell the general public that. The Air Force in 1952, when there was, in the summer of 1952, there was a huge flap of sightings. Hundreds of sightings, 20, 30, 40, 50 a day sometimes, and sightings over Washington, D.C.
I mean, we've got a little clip that just brings me on to actually the 1942 event that happened, which is known as the Battle of Los Angeles, and just so people can hear the actual newsreel.
The news of the world, Wednesday, February 25th. Once again, Columbia's correspondents in world capitals and the fighting zones in the Western Pacific are ready to give you the latest news direct by shortwave radio.
And now for news of our own West Coast, we take you to Los Angeles and the report of Byron Palmer.
Anti-aircraft guns went into action against unidentified aircraft in the Los Angeles area shortly after 3 a.m. Pacific wartime this morning. The anti-aircraft guns began barking during a blackout ordered by the 4th Interceptor Command at 2:25 a.m. The unidentified object, which some sources thought might be a blimp, moved slowly down the Pacific coast from Santa Monica and disappeared south of Long Beach. Army officials declined to comment on the possibility that the object might have been a blimp. However, it required nearly 30 minutes to travel some 25 miles, far slower than an airplane. Watchers on the rooftop of the Columbia Broadcasting Building in the heart of Hollywood could plainly see the flashes of guns and searchlights sweeping the skies in a wide arc along the coastal area. Concussion of the shells could be felt in downtown Los Angeles, 15 miles away. U.S. Army planes quickly took to the dark skies, but whether they contacted the object has not been announced. Army officials say they will not comment until they receive a full report of the action. Although some watchers say they saw airplanes in the air, semi-official sources say they probably were the U.S. Army's pursuit. Several observers say they saw one or more planes spotlighted by 20 or 30 searchlights. The object moved southward, presumably over Huntington Park at the western edge of Los Angeles, and on southward to about Long Beach on the coast. By 3:30 a.m., observers said the object appeared to be over the south of Long Beach. Searchlights closely followed the object down the coast and kept it centered in their glare. Shells frequently could be seen bursting near the object, but none appeared to hit it. The shooting stopped about 3:30 a.m. The shooting brought warfare to the front door of this city of 1.25 million population for the first time since December 7th. Already it was alert to the presence off the Southern California coast of a Japanese submarine which had pumped 25 shells into an oil field north of Santa Barbara Monday evening. Because of the presence of the submarine, a 3-hour alert was ordered at dusk last night, and civilian authorities stood at their posts while the Army and Navy continued their search for the submersible. The evening alert ended at 10:23 p.m., but another was sounded at 2:22 a.m., and the blackout followed within 3 minutes. It covered Los Angeles County from Santa Monica to Pomona. At 2:27, all Southern California radio stations were ordered off the air, except those in San Diego. Approximately 20 minutes after the firing died down, the ship returned and headed westward from Long Beach toward Santa Monica. The guns went into action again, hurling round after round of shells at the object. The second barrage appeared to be closer to downtown Los Angeles, since watchers could hear the concussion of the guns more clearly, and the flash of bursting shells was brighter. Then the ship disappeared for the second time over the ocean. We return you now to CBS in New York.
What analysis you've been able to do on that, Bruce, if any?
One photograph. It's surprising that there's only one, but there was one photograph taken by a newsman which shows spotlights or searchlight beams going up to the sky, sort of image at the top. There's a discussion of this on my website, along with a lot of witness testimony of what they recalled. It does appear to have been a rather large. The skeptics claim that it was a balloon, a weather balloon. That's the old weather balloon explanation.
The thing is, if it had been a weather balloon with all those shells, how many shells? I mean, those shells are like 13 pounds in weight.
over 1,000 shells, I think, were fired. I forget the exact number. Again, that's all on my website.
Yeah, they were heavy artillery.
I have for comparison some photos of beams going up and two beams crossing one another in a area where the bright area where the beams cross, and the beams travel through the bright area and out the other side. The bright area is caused by exploding shells, lighting up smoke. And then the beam goes through, and you see it on the other side. So the beam comes up from the ground, goes through this bright region, and then out the other side. In the Los Angeles battle photograph, the beams come up to the object and stop, like there's something opaque in there, something that's blocking the beam from going through. It's not just smoke.
And it really is an extraordinary time, isn't it? Because 1942, the world is in a very nervous situation, of course. And if it had been a blimp or anything like that, one or two of those shells must have hit it.
Well, I'm sure if there had been a blimp, there would have been a flight plan saying, we're coming down over the Los Angeles basin, don't shoot us.
Absolutely. And then it sort of languidly drifted off.
They were a little nervous because of the fact that a submarine, a Japanese submarine that had fired on Santa Barbara. Santa Barbara is about 50 miles north of Los Angeles. This submarine had been a mile or so off the coast and had fired shells at the oil derricks off the coast of Santa Barbara. So they were a little nervous, but, you know, it's one thing to have a submarine, another thing to fly a blimp all the way from Japan and then pass over Los Angeles without doing anything. No wreckage was found from nervousness or a heart attack. I think one had a heart attack, but that was about it. There were chunks of stuff found, but there were chunks of the artillery shells.
I mean, they were big. 13 pounds is quite a weight. And also you've got those exploding up and got your two sort of 30 in the morning. And of course, you're going to frighten the populace to death. Coming forward in time, from Roswell, did you learn anything more about the Roswell event from the FBI files?
Not about that event. That was too early to show up in the FBI file. The FBI was in July of 1947, contacted the FBI and asked the FBI to investigate some of the early witnesses. Assumption that they might be communist sympathizers trying to jeer this reports of flying saucers as if they're claiming that the Soviet Union had developed these aircraft known as flying saucers and were far ahead of us. The FBI actually interviewed a number of witnesses and didn't find anything having to do with communist subversion. That had established the connection between the Air Force and the FBI. This connection was established in late July of 1947. Yes. Then on, the Air Force, the FBI actually investigated some witnesses for a couple of months, and then essentially said, we didn't find anything about communism, so we're going to quit. But and we're going to send any reports that come to the FBI would be sent to the Air Force. But the Air Force told the FBI stuff anyway, and it ended up in FBI files. And there's a very interesting comparison between what the FBI was told, and what the Air Force said publicly.
Let's have a look at the Kenneth Arnold event. Now, most people will be familiar with Kenneth Arnold, but maybe you could just walk us through that one simply because it was a seminal case.
If you really understand the Kenneth Arnold case, you understand the prototype of the single good witness type of sighting. You can't just, in the Kenneth Arnold case, you can't say that he was a publicity seeker or a copycat sighting because there hadn't been any reports like that publicized until his. Yes. He certainly wasn't a copycat. And then when you read carefully through what he wrote, his initial interviews and the long letter that he wrote to the Air Force describing his sighting and his comments made in days, months, and years afterwards. He was flying his small Call Air type of airplane, a small two-seater propeller plane. He sits on the left-hand side of the pilot seat. He was flying in the vicinity of Mount Rainier, southwest of Mount Rainier, looking for a military airplane that had crashed somewhere on the side of Mount Rainier. Nobody knew where it was. He was hoping to find it. But as he's making a loop, he was heading westward, and he made a U-turn to head back eastward and go to a place, Pendleton, Oregon. No, he was heading for Yakima, Washington. But he was about 20 miles from Mount Rainier, 20 miles southwest, and all of a sudden he noticed this bright flash of light. And his first thought was that some hotshot Air Force pilot had buzzed him, and he had seen a reflection off the metal of the airplane. But he looked around and looked around trying to find any airplane, and he couldn't find anything close to him. He saw off to his left, flying northwards, was a C-47 or something that was a standard aircraft. Could see the spacing between the engines on the aircraft and so on. He was able to identify it. This became important because he compared the size of that with the objects that flew between him and Mount Rainier. Anyway, as he's looking around for an airplane, he sees to his north, to his left, a string of these shiny things flipping, as he puts it, flipping and flashing in the sun. And they were flying southward, and they were flying at about his altitude, he thought, traveling along, and they were going to go right past Mount Rainier. He thought there was some new development of the Air Force. He was astonished that he couldn't see wings, any evidence of engines, a vertical stabilizer. It just didn't have the overall shape of an airplane. Instead, it was semicircular on the front and sort of like a convex point on the back. As it traveled, one of the objects had a double crescent at the rear end instead of a convex point. But anyway, he decided that they might go in a straight line the way they were going all the way down to another mountain called Mount Adams, about 50 miles south. And so he decided to see if they did that, he would time them. So he looked at his dashboard clock. One of them went past the edge of Mount Rainier, and then he watched them as they continued. He said they were going in and out of the mountain, the chain of mountains south of Rainier. So they would have been about 6,000 or 7,000 feet above sea level, I guess. Mount Rainier is 14,400 feet. So they were way below the top of the mountain. As they went along, he said he turned his plane sideways and looked out, rolled down the window to be sure there was no chance of reflections of light in his window. This becomes amusing because one of the skeptics who claimed to explain, offered as an explanation for Arnold sighting, the idea that there were water drops on his windshield that were moving water drops. Evidently, the guy didn't realize that Arnold had said he rolled his window down. Anyway, I'll watch these things going off into the distance, flipping and flashing in the sun, as he said, and they disappeared, to his view, about at the distance of Mount Adams, which is about 50 miles. And he looked at his clock, and it was 102 seconds. That calculates to be about 1,700 miles an hour. For comparison, Geiger was the first man to break the sound barrier at 700 approximately miles an hour in October of that year, 1947. So these things are already going 1,000 miles faster than our fastest aircraft.
I mean, that's astonishing, isn't it? Because was that just a month or two before Roswell, or a month or two? I think it was before, wasn't it?
That was June 24th. Landed his airplane at Yakima, Washington, told some of his buddies there must be a new Air Force aircraft. And his report preceded him, or got to his next stop in Pendleton, Oregon. He traveled around in his little airplane selling firefighting equipment. His report got to Pendleton, Oregon before he did. And when he arrived, there were some newsmen there anxious to learn about these new Air Force aircraft. And so he told them and was interviewed on the same day that he had the sighting. And the next day, June 25th, it was published in the paper. And it became widely circulated because these were amazing new aircraft of the Air Force, they thought, the Army Air Force. So it was treated seriously. And it wasn't until several weeks later that the Air Force said that we don't have nothing we have can explain flying saucers. But in the meantime, once his report was published, it turned out that other people had seen things too, and they started reporting. Their reports appeared in the paper. In succeeding years, when the Air Force gathered together all their sighting reports, they found the first sighting report that they had in their file. This is the files of Project Sign, Project Grudge, and Project Blue Book, although the term Project Blue Book subsumes the previous two, so the whole thing is called the file of Project Blue Book, is a case of a Mustang in Britain chasing an object for half an hour. You can look it up. The first UFO case in the American Project Blue Book
That's interesting.
from Britain.
Yeah.
Then there were other sightings in the springtime of 1947. As I said, people had seen these things, but nobody had reported them because they all thought, well, they're accustomed, first of all, to keeping their mouths shut. Happening through the World War, where it was known that loose lips sink ships and stuff like that. You shut up about whatever you saw. It wasn't until the Air Force said we don't know what these things are. People started sending reports to the Air Force. That started between the 25th of June and, 5 days later, the end of June, and then the first of July. The Air Force, over this period of time, collected a couple of dozen sightings. But people who have been diligently collecting sightings from newspapers all over the United States have located something like several thousand sightings at a time.
Yeah.
It was a big major flap, but the Air Force only collected a few things. Nevertheless, that was enough to convince the Air Force. Now, at this point, July 8th of 1947, there's a split in the interpretation of what's going on. And I point this out in my book. Either Roswell is, or I should say Roswell was or was not an extraterrestrial craft. If it was not, the people who think it was not have grabbed onto the so-called mogul balloon theory. I myself go more with the testimony of Major Jesse Marcel, who picked up the material and tested it. He said he couldn't smash it with a hammer, and he couldn't bend it, and couldn't cut it and stuff. Weird stuff, okay?
Yeah, it was some material that his father had been
Right.
involved in finding, and that he brought home to him as a young boy, or a 10 or 11-year-old, I think, and so he was able to actually hold it and feel it.
That was Marcel's son. Jesse
Yeah,
Marcel
that's...
Sr. died way back in the 80s, died within a year or so. You can take either point of view, that Roswell was real or Roswell was not real. If Roswell was real, then it's a slam dunk that the top Air Force people knew weird stuff was going on. If Roswell was not real, you still got a lot of sightings by military military pilots the Air Force couldn't explain, and that's why the Air Force contacted on July 10th the FBI on the possibility that maybe these reports are all hoaxes generated by communist synthesizers. Some of them might be hoaxes. Of course, it turned out the FBI didn't find any evidence of. They did find evidence of hoaxing, a couple of hoaxes, but nothing having to do with communism.
Wasn't there, Bruce, some kind of assessment done by the Air Force? Is it General Shugan? I might have got his name incorrectly there.
Shugan was a part of the Air Force intelligence collection, but you're talking about the estimate of the situation, I think.
Estimate of the situation, sorry, yes.
Started in June of 1947. By the end of the summer, the Air Force, and there's a document in the FBI file generated, I think, near the end of July, which basically said, can't think of the exact wording. It's all real. It's not fictitious or people imagining things. There really is something flying around. That's how the document essentially starts. And it also says the lack of pressure from the top suggests this is something that somebody up at the top, like the president, knows about. It's a very interesting document you find in the FBI file that you don't find in the Air Force file. You find in the Air Force file is by September of 1947. There had been enough analysis of sighting reports. I'm saying forget Roswell. I'm saying forget Roswell, just concentrate on the reports by civilians and military. That was enough to convince the people that there was really something going on, and then these things had specific characteristics. They being able to suddenly appear as if dropping down from a high altitude and suddenly disappear as if disintegration is the term they use. I mean, they're talking about stuff that's so weird it's hard to account for. I'm setting up a project to study this, and that project became Project Sign and started in January of 1948. Between January of 1948 and July of 1948, the Project Sign people collected enough sightings to convince them that this is interplanetary, and they wrote a document called the Estimate of the Situation, in which they argued interplanetary. Passed that up through the ranks, as it were, to top General Vandenberg, who was the Chief of Staff of the Air Force at the time. And here it becomes interesting, even more interesting. He rejected the conclusion. The implication is he rejected the conclusion for lack of proof, he says. But here he's talking to his experts, the people that he effectively has hired to do analysis of all sorts of aircraft and reverse engineering on Soviet aircraft and so on. These people are not dummies. The conclusion was interplanetary. They had good reasons to do so. So my interpretation of his response is essentially he shut down. Explain something first. If you're confronted with a report of a flying saucer, or whatever you want to call it, you try to explain it. You could explain it as a misidentification. The witness couldn't identify something or other, some well-known or known phenomenon, but the witness couldn't identify it. It's a misidentification. Delusions where they just make it up in their mind, hoaxes. It might be aircraft of a another country, in particular the Soviet Union, or it might be something even more bizarre, interplanetary. So the point is that the person who's analyzing the sighting has a bunch of choices that he could claim explains the sighting. They had this interplanetary as an allowable explanation because nobody had told them it wasn't. When Vandenberg told them, sorry, wrong answer, and then they went back to their laboratory and said, well, if that's the wrong answer, we got to have some other answer. That effectively took interplanetary out of the possible list of explanations. From then on, they didn't believe that the Soviet Union had exceeded our own technical capability in terms of flying aircraft and so on. So in other words, they could not buy the idea that the Soviet Union was flying aircraft over the United States. Crash, we can get their secrets. Misidentifications, hoaxes, and delusions as the possible explanations. And so they effectively had to shoehorn everything into that. If you look at the results of Project Blue Book, the overall result of analyzing 13,000 sightings, they claim that they couldn't explain 700. Of course, all you need is one.
Absolutely. Let's talk about the Gemini 2 case of 1966. What was seen there? I beg your pardon, Gemini 11. I've written it as 2.
Kenneth Arnold, I think it's maybe the world's largest article on the Kenneth Arnold sighting is on my website. It started it all. And there's also a lot of stuff on early days. The book also contains a very elaborate, convincing history and analysis of the history of the subject, as I said, which shows, I believe, that the Air Force knew about this, knew that it was interplanetary way back in the late 40s and early 50s. Gemini 11 case, there's another one on my website. That was 2 astronauts, Conrad and Gordon, in a Gemini 11 capsule, traveling southeastward, approaching the coast of Africa, when they saw at their left side something coming along, flashing and getting closer to them. And they both watched it, and they could see it go underneath what looked like underneath the front of their spacecraft. They couldn't tell how far away it was, but it seemed to be close, and it couldn't have been. It must have been in almost the same orbit as the Gemini 11, because you have to understand you're traveling at 17,000 miles an hour up there, 5 miles every second, and this was visible for many seconds, long enough for Gordon, I think it was, take a couple of pictures of it. And these pictures are on my website. Nobody knows what it was. The initial explanation offered by NORAD, North American Air Defense Command, was that there was a Soviet rocket booster for the Proton 3 satellite, the rocket booster itself. They claimed that was what the astronauts saw. But I sat down and did a lot of mathematics and calculated the orbital locations of the Proton booster and the Gemini 11, and they were 3,000 miles apart. And the Proton booster was behind them and to the right, whereas they were seeing something that came in from the left. So that wasn't it. Nobody really knows what it was. No, it's not spherical. It's got a weird sort of a shape to it. What you see are reflections of the sun, presumably, off of this thing. And even more interesting sighting is the Skylab 3, half 2 years later, September of 1973, when the 3 astronauts saw this red light thing out one of their windows and photographed, took 4 photos of it, the 4th photo showing a structure of some weird shape. And again, this must have been traveling almost exactly in the same orbit as they were, because they saw it for many, I think, minutes. It's important to know there were no and are no red satellites. Satellites are typically white, black, or shiny metal.
So I've got a question from Sharon. She said, "I'd love to know your personal views on the reality of UFOs after all your research."
Well, first of all, point number 1 is they're real. Having studied sightings since the latter half of the 60s, I found a number of sightings, many of which I put into my book, which cannot be explained in conventional manners. I studied the explanations offered by skeptics. For example, the Kenneth Arnold case is a good prototype to analyze from this point of view. What could it be that he saw? And numerous explanations have been offered by people over the years. The most recent explanation offered in the late 90s was Pelican.
Wow.
But the official Air Force explanation for that is a mirage of the mountaintops. Now, the problem with the mirage of the mountaintops is mirages of the mountaintops stay over the mountaintops. They don't go left or right. So there's no way shiny objects could appear to be moving from north to south and be mirages. There's more detail on that in my article on Kenneth Harrell in the book. But you can jump way ahead to the O'Hare Airport, 2006, was it? O'Hare Airport sighting of a
that was a huge one, wasn't it?
A circular object that was hovering over one of the gates of United Airlines at O'Hare Airport in Chicago. And the guy who was directing one of these airplanes, he's on the ground looking upwards, signaled to the pilot through the pilot's open window. And he's looking upwards, and that's the key thing. And he sees this circular object, like a donut sort of, up there. And he calls some other people to alert them to the fact that there's something up there above the gate, whatever it was, see something or other, whatever. And as he's watching, all of a sudden it starts to shrink in size and disappear, punching a hole through a cloud, and you can see blue sky through the clouds. Now, that sounds pretty elaborate, and as I said, there was a great reluctance for people to talk. It happened in November 2006, almost exactly 20 years after the famous Japan Airlines sighting of November 1986. A well-known aeronautic reporter, John Hilkovich, got interested in this and interviewed a whole bunch of people and wrote a story about it that appeared in the Chicago paper on the 1st or 2nd of 2007, I believe. And
yeah.
They were astounded at getting like 3 million responses on their website. That's the conventional news media can't believe that UFOs are real, and therefore they can't believe that anybody has any interest in the subject. And so when somebody shows some interest in the subject, they poo-poo the whole thing. The FAA was confronted with an explanation: how can something hover over a gate of an active airport without somebody knowing about it and doing something about it? I mean, in principle, it could cause a accident. They then had to investigate, and they publicized their explanation was it wasn't really a solid thing up there. It was actually a reflection of, how did they say it first?
Another reflection. Okay.
A reflection of ground lights on the clouds or something like that. Go over very well with Hilkovich or anybody else, you know. It makes no sense at all. So then they said, well, it was some strange weather phenomenon, and left it at that. That was sort of, in terms of skeptical approach to this, a replay of what happened when the Japan Airlines, again, this Japan Airlines is a big article on my website. Japan Airlines, flight 1628 from November 14th, I think it was, or 16th of 1986. The FAA, Federal Aeronautics Administration, investigated this sighting starting in early 1987. They investigated the sighting because the pilot had been told that radar picked up some stuff as they were flying over Alaska at night. The pilot had contacted, the plane had contacted the Anchorage Air Route Traffic Control Center to report that there were objects right in front of them. The captain and the other people, the captain, the co-pilot, and the flight engineer, 3 people on board this Boeing 747 freighter aircraft, were flying southward in the northeastern corner of Alaska when they saw suddenly the captain said, 2 spaceships suddenly appeared in front of us. About a mile away, they were lines of flaming lights or something like that that outlined a dark space as if there was a rectangular craft in front of them. 2 of them. And at first they were one above the other, and then they readjusted and became side by side, and they stayed there for many minutes, and then disappeared off to the left. After they disappeared from in front, the cloud was looking around to see if he could see where they went.
To perhaps give chance for that little bit of interference to pass, I wanted to talk to you about the Kaikoura lights over New Zealand. So I've got that video, which is only just about 3.5 minutes, which I'd love people to hear the live reporting of UFOs. So we're going to hear that now, and then we'll come back to you.
And midnight on December the 30th, 1978, that this Undersea aircraft took off in New Zealand on a newspaper delivery run. It followed the route taken 10 days earlier by a plane which had reported weird flying objects off the Kaikoura coast, objects confirmed by radar controllers in Wellington. Now a TV crew was on board with Australian reporter Quentin Fogarty.
We're now approaching the Clarence River, where the highest concentration of UFOs was sighted on the morning of December the 21st. We're We're at an altitude of 14,000 feet, and we're on exactly the same route taken by Captain Fell when he encountered those mysterious objects. It's a beautiful clear night outside, and naturally we'll be looking out for anything unusual.
Hardly had Fogarty spoken when things began to happen.
We've just heard from Wellington radar that we've got an object about a mile behind us and it's following us. Let's hope they're friendly. It's really getting a bit frightening up here. There's a whole formation of unidentified flying objects behind us.
But there were closer encounters to come. On the return journey from Christchurch, Fogarty spotted another object.
It's extremely bright, much brighter than any of the other stars in the sky. Now it's just dimmed, it's gone. It's back again, it appears to be going behind cloud. I can't quite make out whether it in fact is going behind cloud or whether in fact the light is just dimming. No, it's such a bright light, it's lighting up the clouds around it. This is by far the best of the unidentified flying objects we've seen so far. According to our cameraman, David Crockett, who's been filming it for the past few moments, it appears to have a brightly lit bottom and a transparent sort of sphere on top, so it appears to be, well, like a flying saucer. We've got another one right in front of us, very bright, giving off an orange flashing light. It looks like an aircraft beacon. It seems to be rolling and turning. Oh, I don't know. I really don't know what's going on.
After the plane landed at Blenheim, the investigation began. Skeptics suggested they'd seen the planet Venus, but most of the film was taken more than half an hour before Venus could have been visible. An American Navy physicist, Dr Bruce Maccabee, analyzed the film and rejected theories that it showed meteors or ships or birds. Several of the objects had shown up on radar screens. One of them had left this extraordinary trail on a single frame of film. And although the start of this sequence is out of focus, some frames seem to show what the TV crew and pilots said they'd seen: a luminous base with a transparent top. Dr Maccabee's conclusion: no known explanation could account for all the facts.
Again, just to hear real-time original footage was very interesting. So can you test your mic or your phone and see if we can hear you?
This is sort of the best I can do, I think.
Okay.
Holding the microphone right in front of my mouth.
Okay. I've got another question just before we go on to talk about the New Zealand sighting. Just about your views and what are they on alien encounters? I know that you have actually addressed the issue of alien abduction in your book, and we'll talk about your book shortly as well. And have you ever come across military or other evidence that indicate their existence? Well, what are your views are on alien encounters? I don't know if you've had any or whether you've heard of other people who have had alien encounters. I
call the sightings of objects which clearly are not conventional phenomena, alien flying craft, AFC, and to be completely neutral about who's piloting, and I call them other intelligences, OI. Something is going on. Whether they're, I don't know. I don't claim to know where they're from, what they're doing here. Whatever, all the questions that everybody would like to ask. I know the answers, but I do know one answer: they're real.
Well, that's what the Honourable Paul Hellyer also said. He was Canada's ex-Minister of Defence years ago, but in that role, again, didn't have anything to do much with the UFO side of things, but in his retirement certainly has. He's really taken off with that one and banging the drum for the reality of ET, which is wonderful. So I just wanted to talk about the Kaikoura light, the New Zealand sighting. Again, that was an astonishing bit of footage, and that it was real time at the time, which is extremely unusual, very rare.
It's much more complicated to understand than you get from that little documentary blurb. You have to get things in historical order and then analyze the film images along verbal descriptions. It's still the only case that I'm aware of which was argued out in the refereed literature. You can find on my website the analysis of the New Zealand case, and the part where he says this is by far the best UFO we've seen so far has been explained, claimed to have been explained as a squid boat, which of course is on the surface of the water. There was no such squid boat, and it did things that the squid boat couldn't do. Like if it were a squid boat, it would have to be fishing from an altitude of about 3,000 feet. So the squid boat have to do with it anyway. The answer is the squid fishing fleet, primarily from Japan, goes into the southern waters around New Zealand in November, December, January, and February of each year. And one of these boats has a whole bunch of 10,000 watt lights strung along the side, squid up to the surface, and then they use nets to pull a squid out. So they can do squid netting 24/7, you might say. So they when you imagine 10 or 20 10,000 watt light bulbs running, a couple 100,000 watts worth of incandescent light, this is bright enough to be picked up by a satellite flying over. That's the only possible explanation to consider would be a squid boat, and yet this thing moved along with the aircraft at speeds of 100 miles an hour or so. So, as I said, you can read the article that was published in a technical journal called Applied Optics way back in the summer of 1979, an article that I published, and then some people from this New Zealand Department of Science and Industrial Research wrote a rebutting article claiming there was a squid boat, and then I wrote a letter to the editor explaining why it wasn't a squid boat. Now, after all the years of UFO sightings, you would think that some sightings, besides just this one, would have made it into the refereed press and been discussed. That's what we call normal science. Somebody says, look, I discovered so-and-so, and he writes it up and publishes it. And then somebody else comes along and says, no, you didn't discover it. Or maybe the person says, yes, you did, whatever. There's some comment on it. And gradually more information is gained, and either the discovery is supported or denied by further research. This could have happened in a number of UFO cases over the years, but as far as I know, this is the only one to make it into, as I said, a very technical journal, which is called Applied Optics.
Okay, we're just losing you a little bit on that phone again. I don't know whether, again, it's the atmospherics around you. We're just beginning to break up slightly again.
I'll try to be better. Anyway, the New Zealand case was extremely complicated. It involved a 16-millimeter color movie that had to be analyzed, many minutes of movie film, tape recording by the Wellington Air Traffic Control Center, radar tape was allowed us to determine the times of every event that occurred, and there was a tape recording made by Quentin Fogarty on the airplane, which you were part of in that little segment that you played. You heard an announcer, and then you heard Quentin Fogarty talking. Quentin Fogarty wrote a book called Let's Hope They're Friendly, which is a phrase that he used while he was on board the aircraft and things were happening.
Fascinating to hear, people who were hoping to see something and then, below me, it happened. I mean, it's like that thing, be careful what you wish for. It was a film crew as well.
Now, how that happened, I happened to be involved, as described in my book, the FBI-CIA UFO Connection. And it was because of the analysis of the New Zealand case that I got connected up with the CIA the first time.
Oh, right, is it?
Went to the CIA looking for some help in analyzing the radar aspects of the sighting. They said, okay, we'll let you talk to a radar expert, but we want to know what's going on. So I gave a lecture on the sighting itself, the whole thing, to a group of guys there at the CIA.
To the CIA? Okay.
Yeah. Then and two of them invited me back afterwards to discuss UFOs in general. That happened in 1979, and then I had no further connection with the CIA until I was called up by a guy named Ron Pandolfi, who was interested in my work on laser-generated underwater sound, LGUS. And his first call to me in 1983, I think it was, he indicated he wanted me to give a lecture on the subject. The next day, he called me up and we discussed this. And then he called up a second time. Now, I said nothing about my previous visit to the CIA having to do with UFOs. But he apparently had talked to some people, and they recognized my name. And when he called up the second time, he said, "Oh, by the way, I understand you've been here before." A cold chill sort of went through my back.
Yeah. Before you get on to that part, I've just got one last question, just pertaining to the New Zealand one. Well, I know we're talking about the New Zealand incident now, but it just says, this is from Jimmy, and it says, because that pretty pattern was recorded in one frame of the video of the UFO, what does that suggest to Bruce? Could camera shake account for it?
That is my interpretation. There was no evidence that the object itself was making any rapid movements like that. What we're talking about is a single frame of a tenth of a second, actually less than that, 1/30th of a second approximately, in which image of a shape is similar to the so-called ampersand.
Sorry, we're just losing you again there, Bruce.
It indicates a considerable amount of motion of the image relative to the camera. And so the question is, did the light itself make this complicated image, or as a result of the camera vibration? In fact, the camera vibration, Quentin Fogarty, the cameraman, was holding the camera on his shoulder, and he had to be careful that he didn't bump any switches on the top of the cockpit he was crouched down in. And I suspect that he did actually hit something and caused a high-frequency vibration to create that one image.
Right, yeah. It is tremendously difficult to hold a camera still for any length of time. Gosh, and he was aboard a plane at the time as well, so...
He was holding a movie camera, a Bolex camera. But it had a big reel on top and another reel on the bottom.
Oh, wow. Yeah, that's the heavy things, too. So we're just coming back to you educating the CIA with your lecture on UFOs.
Ron Pandolfi and I did work on this laser-generated underwater sound, and I kept returning to the CIA a number of times to discuss laser-generated underwater sound because it was he was afraid that he had documents showing the Soviets were doing work on the same thing, and one job of the CIA is to make sure nobody gets ahead of us. So he first of all looked to see who in the United States was doing work on that same work. And the only person he found was me and a cohort of mine at the Naval Surface Warfare Center. So we ended up supplying him information. And it's all spelled out in the book how things turned out. But finally, in 1987 was a big year for UFOs when the Japan Airlines case happened in November of 1986. The FAA investigated it in 1987. So they had the FAA investigation in 1987 of the Japan Airlines case. Then in February, Communion by Whitley Strieber came out.
Yeah.
And Intruders by Bud Hopkins, 2 books on abduction stuff. And later on in the spring, the Majestic 12 or MJ-12 documents were released. They were first released by Timothy Good in England in his Love Top Secret. And then they were released by Bill Moore and Jamie Chandray in June of 1987. And we had a big UFO symposium, International UFO Symposium, the Mutual UFO Network, in July of 1947. And after that, Ron asked me to give a UFO lecture at the CIA, which I did. And he told me I created a whole bunch of spies in the agency, people who were using their clearance levels to see if they could find out anything about UFOs from information to the agency. If somebody found something, they didn't tell me.
You're just breaking up there. Listen, I'm just thinking, again, just perhaps to give the line a bit of a chance to recover if that can happen even. How about we just give you a little break and we'll come back and talk about perhaps the Gulf Breeze event, which you did a lot of work on. But first, I think we should hear another of your very talented pieces with you playing. This is called When I Was Young. I think I've got the right name. So let's see if it is. Wonderful.
My
But-
son on the drums.
Oh, is it? How fantastic. You get to play together very much?
Oh, yeah, I've been able to play together for 6 years, I guess, since I moved
Oh.
to, I can't really duplicate what I used to be able to do anyway. Some Parkinson's has said it slows me down. I think that's the first time that piece has ever been aired.
Oh, really? Fantastic.
The Flight of the Bumble Boogie has been played on the air before.
Yeah, that's a crazy piece, but a lot of fun. Again, you know, the reason I'm talking to you is because you've done so much analysis and you come from a science background. You're very well read on the subject, and you've been around people and agencies and bodies that, especially in the earlier years, I'm very interested in. The context is everything, isn't it? And you have a fantastic history, and from that historical perspective, you also must have seen a lot of developments in the UFO field. And I'd be really interested to hear what that's like for you before we talk about Gulf Breeze.
Well, first I'd like to mention the book, The FBI CIA UFO Connection, purchased on Amazon. You can get a Kindle version of it or a paperback order, obviously, and wait for paper delivery.
When was that written? Because you did another one about 15 years or so ago of a similar nature, didn't you?
This is an updated version, and this is the first one to report my interactions with the CIA. It was published last September.
Oh, okay, so just very recently
I have another one which we're working on right now. It'll probably be published in about 2 or 3 weeks. And then My Family. That is a teaching book. If you know nothing about UFOs and you want to learn something about the whole spectrum of it, you can read this book. It's a new form of literature I call fact book, complete with references and bibliography. The novel, the story surrounding it. So the main character in this story is the librarian, finds a book to read on the subject and find out because he figures he needs to know something about it. And he finds a book called What You Should Know About Unidentified Flying Objects. And this book is a fact book. The style of writing is different from the style of the novel and so on. And it contains a lot of stuff which is in the FBI UFO Connection, actually.
Okay.
But as I said, if you know nothing about the subject, you can learn.
It's a good stepping stone.
Have an interesting story that leads you right through this book, and by the time you get finished, you know about history of the subject and sightings and explanations, the failure of explanations, and things that are real, and you learn something about abduction stuff. That'll be out on Amazon in a couple of weeks. There's already an old version, Abduction in My Life, which is only used copies are available. It hasn't been published for years. The new version is an updated, you might say, an updated version of the story.
You've got quite a few papers and documents, articles that people can have a look at as well, looking at the whole background thing. Just going to the abduction scenario, I don't know whether there's interest, but understanding of the abduction phenomena from your perspective.
Well, I say something is really going on, and it's probably somewhat similar, if not identical, to what abductees describe. The reason for it is still not clear. Things are being grabbed and having missing time and so on. that all seems to be real.
Yeah. Have you spoken to many abductees?
Yeah, not a lot. I have not done this. I've not concentrated on abductions like Bud Hopkins or some other research on John Mack or David Jacobs or whatever. But I have met some of the abductees that Bud and Dave and so on worked with, and I did work with Ed Walters in Gulf Breeze. And you want to talk about Gulf Breeze?
That's a huge case.
Gulf Breeze was the UFO center of the world for a while there in the late 80s and early 90s.
And if we just say where Gulf Breeze actually is, because a lot of people won't know.
Imagine the peninsula of Florida sticking out into the Atlantic Ocean and the Gulf of Mexico west of Florida. You go along Florida, along the coast towards New Orleans. Before you get to New Orleans, you get to the end of Florida, and you have Pensacola. You can find Pensacola on the map easily, right west. So it's Gulf Breeze. And it's not on the ocean itself. There's a body of water called the Santa Rosa Sound, which separates the Gulf Breeze from Pensacola Beach, the actual shoreline itself. Anyway, that gives you an idea of where Gulf Breeze is. There's a 3-mile-long bridge, I think it is, that connects Gulf Breeze to Pensacola. Anyway, in 1987, in November, a very strange night occurred in Gulf Breeze. Sightings started at 2:30 in the morning, went through evening, only one of which, of course, was Ed Walters' sighting. This is all spelled out in the FBI UFO book because I gave a lecture on this to the CIA. Anyway, there was a bunch of sightings on the 11th of November, of which one was a sighting by Ed Walters. And he took pictures. It was his pictures that were published in a local newspaper in Gulf Breeze. And no sooner was the pictures published than some other witnesses came forward and say, "Hey, we saw that too." Would have said anything if it hadn't been for the fact that Ed allowed a couple of his pictures to be published anonymously or with a fake name attached to it.
Right.
Allow his name to be used right off. These pictures, as I said, as a result of the publication of the picture, other people came forward and said, "Hey, we saw it too." That's how we learned about the other sightings that occurred on November 11th. Like, for example, Billy Zamet, the wife of a Navy officer, whose dog started barking at 2:30 in the morning. I think it was 2:30. She got up out of bed. The dog wanted to go out. She assumed for the standard reason. And she opened the door, let the dog out. Instead of running out onto the lawn to do what she's expected to do, she noticed the dog started barking, looking upwards and barking. So she looked up. And there she sees this thing, and she says, "Looks just like what was in the photograph." At the bottom, a circular object in the windows, and a blue beam coming down and hitting her dock.
Oh, wow.
And she said, this is in a letter she wrote to the newspaper saying, "I thought I would report it the next day, and then the next day came, and I decided against it." So she wouldn't have said anything if it hadn't been for the fact that Ed's picture was published. There was a guy who saw the same thing at 8:30 in the morning approximately, and some other people in the late afternoon, including the former editor of the local newspaper and his wife saw the object. So there are a number of credible sightings on this day, November 11th, 1987. And Ed's sighting was just one of them when he saw this thing approaching his house, and he thought, but obviously it wasn't that. He realized he went to his door and looked at it, thought he would call police or something, and decided it would be gone by the time somebody showed up. So he better take some pictures, and he took pictures with a Polaroid. That's how it all began, and I could talk about that for several hours, I suppose. At the MUFON Symposium in 1988, I discussed the Gulf Breeze sighting. I think over a period of 2.5 to 3 hour discussion, go through everything.
They also went on for years on and off, didn't they?
Yes, the first period of sightings went from November 11th, 1987, all the way through early July of 1988, culminating with a sighting by a county coroner and his wife of an object hovering near their house, which they claimed was exactly the same as in Ed's pictures. Then the sighting rate diminished for a while, came back again in 1989, diminished again, and then in November 1990, a sort of a new type of sighting, the so-called red bubble sightings began. They were interspersed with disc-type sightings. And then in September of 1991, they started seeing rings of light up in the sky, and that's when I got interested and decided to go to Florida. In time, I had gone there early to talk to Ed, and I visited in September of 1991, and there had been so many sightings that there were people who went out every night looking for something, and very often they found it. News media did too. There were a lot of stories. That's why I said Gulf Breeze was like the sort of the UFO center of the world for a while.
I think I understand correctly that Ed Walters himself is an abductee.
That's what we deduce Bruce from his story, September of 1991, I too saw a ring of lights appear up in the sky.
Oh,
And
okay.
I didn't panic and call for the guys in white coats to come and take me away, because there were 30 other people. There were photographs. There was triangulation. I listened to see if it was a hoax device on a little motorized aircraft, but I had a big ear type of sound concentrator, which would pick up a whisper at 100 feet or something like that. Nothing at all associated with this object, which appeared in the sky. It traveled a short distance and then apparently went upwards or somehow went out. I don't know. My first thought for these Bubba sightings was, of course, hoax.
Bruce, are you saying Bubba? B-U-B-A? Bubba sightings?
B-U-B-B-A, yeah.
What's the Bubba stand for?
It's assumed that Bubba is a phrase used by not too well educated Southerners to mean brother.
Okay. Oh, got the red Bubba.
You were always at a abductee. In 1988, as the investigation was going on, now, this was a unique situation in Gulf Breeze. The investigators discovered that things were going on strange and were able to interview Ed and other witnesses while the sightings were going on. We, in fact, the investigators had an impact on the type of information that was available. And one of the key things that I did was get Ed to take pictures with a stereo camera, which allowed us to measure distances. Anyway, he had this habit of writing down notes. He'd think of something in the middle of the night, get up, write down some stuff, and go back to bed. Or maybe in the morning he would write down what he remembered overnight. And he came up with some very puzzling dreams, or whatever you want to call them, things that he had written in his little notebook over the months of these sightings. Finally, in the summer of that year, he was hypnotized, regressed by a clinical therapist, Dan Overlay, who worked with the police. And under hypnosis, he recalled being taken on board craft and a number of things that are very suggestive, which I've built into my abduction book story. One of the most interesting things he described was he would be put into a condition, a situation, like one he described was, he suddenly finds himself in a room with a completely closed room that's, I don't know, 10 or 15 feet in diameter or whatever. There's two 50-gallon drums in the room, with covers for the drums. And his are two children, whether they're boys or girls, I don't know, two children. And he's in this room with these kids in the oil drums. And all of a sudden the wall opens up and a lizard-like crocodile-type creature comes lumbering in. And it's apparent that the creature is going to try to eat somebody. And so Ed is confronted with the problem of who is he going to save, himself and one kid, or is he going to put the two kids, one in each barrel? That's all it can fit. Ed said put the two kids in the barrels and then prepared to fight this oncoming croco monster, whatever it was. All of a sudden the walls melted away, the crocodile melts away, the kids melt away, and he is made to sit on a table. They lower a bracket over his head. You could call it a helmet, but really it's like 4 points of contact. One point of contact above his nose, above the eye, line made by the eyebrows above his nose. One on each side of his head, and one on the back of his head. So there's 4 points of contact for this sort of a pseudo helmet. And he says he's in this room. Opposite him is another table. They bring in several little ones, little creatures, either standard gray type things, and they each have a helmet on their head. And he says then he starts to relive this experience that he just had. And then they take those kids out and bring in another batch put the helmets on their head, and he replays what he did again. And this happened a number of times, according to Ed. And there is some physical evidence of that. He had a sighting on May 1, 1988. He had said many times earlier that he got a humming noise in his head, and that's alerted him to how he happened to have the camera available so often. He'd get a humming noise and know that something was going to happen. So he went out to the Shoreline Park area on the south side of Gulf Breeze, bordering the Santa Rosa Sound. And he set up this stereo camera that I had asked him to make. The Polaroid camera is 2 feet apart, and he had practiced so that he could click the two cameras at the same time and thereby create a stereo image. Looking at the same thing from two different perspectives allows you to measure the distance to it. Fortunately, there was a calibration point. The lights of a bridge appear in the pictures, so they are self-calibrated for distance. And he saw this Type 1, what I call it, Type 1 Ed craft, turned out to be 450 feet away from the shore. And there was another type, smaller, 2.5-foot size thing. It showed up also in the picture at about 135 feet from the shore. This picture. I was preparing to take a second picture. All of a sudden he realized that he didn't see that big thing out there over the center of the sun anymore. Instead it was right over his head, and everything went white, and he blanked out. He knew that he had been gotten there about 12:30 or something like that. When he wakes up, he's on the edge of the shore, edge of the water line, and it's an hour and a half or something like that later by his watch. And he said he suddenly got a picture of his daughter. And his wife had taken his son to someplace, to another high school football game or something. So his daughter was alone at the house. He quickly packed up the camera, put it in the truck, drove home as quickly as he could, confirmed that his daughter was okay, and sat outside her door for the rest of the night. And then later in the morning, he got up. He felt horrible, and a horrible odor under his fingernails. And he washed his hands, and he's looking in the mirror, and he sees this red spot in his head, right over his nose. And he later had a UFO investigator photograph it. It was evidently, also he said he felt around his head, and he felt a bump on the left side, and a bump on the right side, and a bump on the back. So he had some, as I said, some sort of physical evidence that this had actually happened. Under hypnosis, it turned out that this was one of the nights when he was, well, quote, a teacher, unquote.
Funnily enough, I was speaking to a lady who called me for the first time today. She was eager to tell me that she had, let's call them implants, and that were not very far beneath the skin, and was hoping that we would be able to perhaps remove those to get those analyzed, perhaps at some point. My goodness.
Implants have been removed. I remember seeing one guy who had something in his under part of the skin of his finger, and it reacted to a magnet. There were no scars I can remember, but you could actually see something was moving under the skin if you moved the magnet. If it was a strong magnet, you moved it around.
And I don't know whether you're familiar with Steve Colburn, who's a carbon nanotube specialist. He's done a lot of work with Roger Lear when he was still with us for over 6 years, and is himself an abductee, and so has done a lot of research on this area, and a lot of very bizarre, very anomalous readings.
Right. Ed didn't seem to have an implant. A number of stories. One of the stories that he told had to do with being fishing in a boat in near Corpus Christi, Texas, on some lake. It was I presume, a warm day. He was out there by himself fishing, and he was drifting along, and all of a sudden something bumped the boat that he was in. 10 or 15 or 20 feet deep there. He couldn't imagine what he bumped. But he bumped something. I forget the details, but he's moving along with oars, I guess. Something bumps him again, and he notices up ahead of him a greenish glow coming up from the water. And he said that it became apparent that there was something down there, and he started poking at it with the oars, trying to hit it. And he says he remembers that much. The next thing he remembered was he wakes up lying in the boat. And under hypnosis, it turned out to be one of these teaching experiences again.
They seem to be quite common. I don't know if Ed Walters continued having experiences as well as sightings.
Well, I don't know. He hasn't been active in the subject for a long time, and he wouldn't tell me everything, I'm sure. But I do know that he had photographic cases up to 1996 or 7.
Yeah.
There's a little book called UFOs Are Real, Here's the Proof by Ed Walters and me. It's a paperback. I suppose it's available on Amazon. I'm not sure. There's only used copies of it. It's an Avon book. Anyway, it has a whole bunch of pictures in it. Some of them that were taken in the 87, 88 time frame, but mostly pictures taken by other people who wrote him letters of their own sightings and include photos. His own sightings. He had January 1990, multiple witness sighting of a red light hovering over Gulf Breeze itself, and this is very interesting because other people photographed it and got images that are weird. In 1992, I think it was, he had a video on a dock. In 1993, maybe it was 1993, he had a video on a beach. 1995 or 1994, a photograph of a UFO hovering over the Santa Rosa Sound, and it looked like it was sucking up I think that was April of '94. It looked like it was sucking up water from the center of the sound. There's a line going from the water of the sound up to the bottom of this image of the UFO. January '94, I think, is when we got a picture of an F-15 jet flying past a UFO that was up in the sky. There are a number of other cases I'd have to go back and review. It's been a long time since I thought about it, but some of them are discussed on my.
Just got a couple of questions as well, Bruce. So what do you think of the pictures taken from the space station, mainly showing all the orbs and other bodies that seem to be out there that don't appear to be spacecraft?
Well, I'm not convinced that they're all those things are spacecraft. I think there's a lot of that stuff is junk that's traveling along with a spacecraft, ice crystals and stuff. But the big thing is NASA holds all the cards for that. You'll be absolutely sure of what you're getting when you get a NASA download. So you could spend an awful lot of time spinning your wheels, let's say. The Gemini 11 sighting and the Skylab 3 sighting that I worked on, for example, you have witness testimony. They saw it happen. It's not something that was just picked up by a camera. They actually saw these things themselves and took photographs of them. So you know there was really something out there.
Another question, this is from Jimmy, just asking if you have any information about the dark or on the dark night satellite apparently in orbit around the planet, if you have any knowledge of that at all.
No, I don't. I've heard about it, but I don't have any information on it.
Bruce, you also set up FUFOR, and that is the fund for research into, have I got the name right, UFO?
The Fund for UFO Research, back in 1979. The idea was to act like the National Science Foundation. Ask for donations of money, to ask for people to submit proposals for research projects, and the proposal would have to say what the project was and what the outcome would be and how much it would cost and how long it would take and all sorts of stuff. Same way as you would have to submit a proposal to the National Science Foundation. And the fund for UFO Research, for example, was able to put on the first international MUFON UFO symposium in 1987 because we collected money from a number of people. We had a dozen countries, I guess, or so represented, including Britain. And we were able to pay the expenses of travel of a whole bunch of people.
Yeah, that's fantastic.
We collected money. The fund, I think, is sort of exists in name only now. I don't know if they do anything.
You did, in the early days, bought the microfilm of the Air Force's Project Blue Book materials. I assume then that there is probably some kind of a library, is there?
No, anything we had, we sent either to the Center for UFO Studies or the Mutual UFO Network.
Again, this is sort of 1981, and it's the Citizens Against UFO Secrecy who actually brought, they had a press conference dealing with a lawsuit against the NSA, the National Security Agency, for refusing to release a large number of UFO-related documents. I don't know if it was, the fund was also associated with or supported that as well. From that suit, there was indeed then a releasing eventually of material.
Yeah, it's been a long time, but I believe we've supported the work done by Peter Gersten, who was a lawyer, first sued the CIA on behalf of an organization called Ground Saucer Watch. Then the CIA released a bunch of documents and then withheld some of which the NSA, and so, but I had already gotten the documents out. Nobody sued the FBI, sued the National Security Agency, and that led to some more documents way back in the early 80s.
And it's really laying the foundation for what we're able to do today and the information we're able to glean today. So I do thank you for all your efforts. And I know that you would have been working quite alone at one time. It's important to flag up that we do owe a small debt of gratitude to great folks like yourself who continue just to move forward and push that envelope.
I appreciate your compliments. Times when I ask myself, why am I doing this?
Oh, ditto.
Especially when I was analyzing the New Zealand case. It also happened with the MEM0RIAM photographs, which are famous photographs taken by Paul Trent. showing an object in the sky in a barn at the left-hand side. It's been published in probably more than any other UFO photographs. You get into such minute details, technical details and so on, that all require resolution if you're going to come up with a conclusion. Times, especially in analyzing the New Zealand case, when I spent hundreds of hours, I would say, at night looking at the film and doing calculations and all sorts of stuff. And I'd ask myself, why am I doing this? The answer always came back, because I want to know. Whether anybody else cares or not, that's up to them.
Again, just thank you for doing it all, because it means that people like myself don't have to, because you've already done that little bit. And it really is a great springboard and a great wealth of information. You know, the days that when you secured, like through the Freedom of Information Act back in the 70s, those FBI files, I mean, I think had circumstances been slightly different, and as you say, if it had been the Air Force, that wouldn't have happened. But lucky for you, you did it through the FBI. And I think that was inspired, because now this information, it's there. Right. And thank you very much. And I really hope, so your book was published last year, and also last year you won the Lifetime Achievement Award for your work. So congratulations from that, and well earned, I might say. And that was from the International UFO Congress. And it's been a long history like yours. We get the beauty of the perspective and the context that you have of the earlier years. Your book, Abduction in My Family, and I'm just wondering if there is any issues in your family, or whether there is anything in the grandparent line, or has anybody else around you, close to you, had any experiences?
My grandmother saw two round objects travel and make a right angle turn way back in 1947. Apparently one of the first UFO witnesses. Well, I didn't find out about it until late 1960s. Realized I was interested in UFOs and told me about her mother's sighting. So I interviewed with Grandma. Somewhere I've got a tape of her describing. There are other pieces too on the web that anybody can listen to. But you people in my family who have the book Abduction in My Family, I've publicized for the first time sightings that happened here near Lima, Ohio, where I now live with my wife Jan. And she's been directly involved with sightings. And one of the sightings that she was involved with described in the book, published for the first time. We'll get into the paranormal. We've done EVP stuff. You know what that is? What I'd call Class A EVPs.
How interesting. Oh, well, maybe we can hear some of those sometime. This all somehow interlinks, you know, the near-death experience, the EVP stuff, and there's such a crossover with the paranormal. Have you experienced a lot of paranormal activity?
I seem to be not paranormalized.
We've had a little bit of a struggle to hear you completely well.
You had asked if I was directly involved with paranormal myself, I'd say. If you exclude UFOs as being, if you call that paranormal or not, I've sort of plugged into UFOs, and I've had a sighting myself that mentioned the sighting of a ring of lights that shouldn't be in the sky.
Yeah.
But mostly I've been things like analyzing explanations for sightings and finding that the skeptics are wrong. The sightings should be left unexplained. You know, arriving at a conclusion based on an analysis and logic.
Can I just ask, is the report, the estimate of the situation, available on your website?
No one has seen the estimate of the situation. Edward Ruppelt, the first director of Project Blue Book, claimed that he saw it. General Vandenberg ordered that all copies be destroyed. Apparently they all were, but not all at the same time, because a couple of people claim to have seen it.
All right. It puts me in mind of the Robert Dean material, the assessment. I don't know whether you're familiar with that material, but he was in the army.
Yeah, right. I have not studied his stuff.
But he reports extensively about what he read. A piece of material called the assessment, which is a bit like the estimate of the situation kind of scenario, when in shape in 1966. He was stationed over in Paris, and there were these objects coming from the direction of Russia, which suddenly had the West with their fingers hovering over certain buttons, and then they pull back and thought, just a minute, let's check and see what's going on. Well, it turns out that whatever they saw belonged to nobody, and so they did a joint assessment, And the upshot of that was basically that there was nothing to fear, essentially, because if there was, we would already know about it. There's been 2 fairly substantial reports, and the public has not had sight of them, or probably ever will. That was seen once by Bob Dean, and then it was removed from him. It was a top secret document. He was allowed to see the ones, and apparently there were only 15 copies, according to him, that he was told about, and who knows where the others ever went.
I know there's a lot of stuff. A guy in the United States here, Robert Hastings, went around collecting reports of UFOs flying over missile bases and affecting missiles.
I've read UFOs, some of those reports as well, and even of arming the nukes. Mostly we hear about them disarming and scrambling their codes. So much going on, isn't there? And who knows which faction's working for whom.
You've got Rendlesham Forest right there.
And the Rendlesham Forest, the whole
not far away is Stonehenge and a whole bunch of circles.
Absolutely. So there's an enormous amount of energetic points around the planet as well. So I just wanted to go through your books again. FBI, CIA, UFO Connection, and that's an updated rewrite of your, I think it was 2000 book of a similar name.
This one has more in it. The first time that I publicized my CIA stuff.
Then there is the Abduction in My Family, and that again is an update of Abduction in My Life. This one is coming out shortly, which is a great introduction to the whole field of UFOs.
Yes.
You co-wrote with Ed Walters, UFOs Are Real. Co-authored one or two other books.
In 1997 was a real. Here's the proof.
Right. Are there any other books?
And Ed Walters' first book, The Gulf Breeze Sighting, small parts of other books. Amazon has pretty well collected stuff.
What's your website up there, which is www.brumac, that's brumac.8, the number 8, k.com. And you can see papers and articles on the website, as well as download some of this wonderful honky-tonk music. And for those who are interested in more blues, honky-tonk, and that kind of thing, you can listen to Gal Holiday, and you can see her on YouTube, and she is Bruce's daughter. Wonderful. There's nothing like music to change an energy on things. So
if you look up Ashley Maccabee on YouTube.
Ashley Maccabee. Okay.
Ashley Maccabee. Then you can find a whole bunch of his drum solos and stuff.
Fantastic. Well, what's your daughter's name?
Vanessa Niemann, Niemann.
Is there anything else you'd like to finish off with and sharing? And again, thank you very much for all that you've done over the years. So bless you for that.
To quote Quentin Fogarty while he was on that noisy aircraft flying along with weird things happening around the plane.
The New Zealand one.
Friendly.
Let's hope they're friendly. Thank you very much, Dr. Bruce Maccabee. Thank you to Vin. Thank you for everybody else for your patience. I'm sorry we had some problems on the sound. Nothing that we could do about that, I'm afraid. I think the Ohio deluge there has taken its toll. You've been a great guest, and I, again, thank you very much for all you've done for the field.
Well, thank you for inviting me, and thanks for your comment.
All right, everybody, thank you very much. And this is good night and goodbye from the Ammach Files.
You have been listening to the Ammach Files. And we're here with Eklectia's very own Gary Williams.
The ET Newsroom. If, like me, you've had a sighting or experience with...
Say nothing.
Aliens, off-planet intelligences, and want to speak to somebody about it, who will listen to you and understand.
Shh.
Contact ETN on 0795 1752 813.
Big white triangle.
Or email etnewsroom@gmail.com.